Very few people know that many of the German scientists who came to America with Operation Paperclip are buried right here in our own backyard. This is Conrad Dannenberg, buried in the city cemetery of Huntsville, Alabama, with dozens of other veterans of Operation Paperclip. Now, what's so fascinating about this man is that he decided to leave NASA but continued to work as a bus operator and tour guide, which brought him very close to the Marshall Space Center over philosophical differences. This was at a time when Skylab was allowed to fall back to the Earth, and his argument was that now that we were starting to explore space, it was our moral imperative to keep all of our space flights up in the air as long as possible. He argued we should have gotten help from the Soviets in the height of the Cold War and to work hand in hand. To this end, he was on the board of directors of the L5 Society, which saw it as a moral imperative to keep exploration going and to colonize the stars. This is Hans Polero. Hans Polero was born in February of 1919, and he was also a part of the Wernher von Braun group, the heading of the new office of the Vehicle Systems Integration. Now, what's so interesting is that a lot of these scientists have very little known about them. For example, William Mrazek, he has a little bit more known about him. He's one of the older veterans. He was the director of the ABMA Structures and Mechanics Lab and worked closely with the Jupiter missile systems. He was born in Austria and is buried only feet away from other doctors and scientists who worked closely with Wernher von Braun. You can also see he was the director of the Structures and Mechanics Laboratory of the Army's Ballistics Missile Agency right here in Huntsville. But as Wernher von Braun's group started to disintegrate after they were no longer needed and their tech was out of date, he started running a restaurant with his wife. And this is sort of the pattern that's shown by a lot of these scientists who worked at the Marshall Space Center. It's just something that they weren't able to keep up with modern rocket science. This is Hans Hütter. You can see he's looking very austere there. The director of the Agena and Centaur programs, and he directed a number of laboratories at Huntsville. And what's fascinating is just walking through this graveyard, so many of the graves have German writing on them, German epitaphs. It's almost like you're walking through a German graveyard, which kind of you are. Again, he only lived until January 1st, 2005, almost like he was rounding off the year. And he died in 1970, one of the older scientists. He worked with 129 other people who escaped from the Peenemünde when the Soviets were invading, helped to hide the secrets there. He was also in this photo on the side. You can see that he continued his work relatively late in his life. And here's Werner Dahm, who also worked very closely, as did all of these scientists, with Wernher von Braun in Huntsville, Alabama. You can see he was the chief of Marshall Space Flight Center's Aerophysics Lab and was also the last German scientist working on it. There were over 120 men who came as a part of that program, but, it died off very quickly, especially after the Saturn rockets revolutionized space travel, and pretty soon most of their research was rendered obsolete. Now, this is Walter Hausermann, who was the chief of guidance and control at the Redstone Arsenal, and he's buried here on the right. And you can see he's also buried at the foot of Dahm's grave. Gone is only who becomes forgotten. This is Fritz von der See, buried here. He died in 1976. A lot of these scientists died in the 1970s, and a lot made it all the way up until the early 2000s, but his philosophy was people come to us with ideas, and we try to convert them into steel. He was basically the chief of the village smithy of this area. They were metal workers. This is Gustav Kroll, who, again, lived until the early 2000s, and they talk a little bit about how when Wernher von Braun left the program, most of the scientists were out to pasture, so to speak, and one of the last working there, who had also worked with the German V2 program, was this man, who's buried here in Huntsville. They continued up until the 1970s, and I believe even the 1980s. This is Hermann Kroger, our friend, our strength, our father. And you can see that he took a crucial role in this program, the deputy director of NASA's Astronautics Laboratory right here in Huntsville. All of these folks were in Huntsville. Interesting also, he was hunting with a couple of astronauts there. But this is Ernst Geissler, and this is 1958. Early in the program, there were some public outcry over whether or not we should really be using these German scientists. And eventually the president just said that he would have the final say in whether or not we would deport these scientists back to Germany. And eventually it was decided that we would not.